Welcome to the Rooney Report. Today we have with us Dr. David Deavel. Dave, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
So, you had edited this book about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I read it, and I read his book, The Gulag of Archipelago, and he has so much to offer our Western culture, and I'd just like to have this program where we can focus on his view of human life and dignity, and then also maybe talk a little bit about, you know, some of the other Russians that are mentioned in this book. So he went through probably one of the most difficult times, you know, that a human could go through, you know, being in the Gulag and so forth, and yet he came out of it a much better person, and I know there's a lot in between there, but how does he deal with that? You know, like, do you think that he felt he was chosen in a way to take that path? Or?
Yeah, I mean, he was born right around the time of the Russian Revolution. Mm-hmm. His father was a military officer who died before he was born. He was raised by his mother and his grandmother, who were devout Orthodox Christians. Mm-hmm. But as a child of that time and a child in that period, right, he naturally took up the Marxist view of things,
right,
and thought that it was good. He became a decorated military officer during World War II, but he made the mistake of telling a joke in a letter that was critical of Joseph Stalin. And so he was put in that gulag, that system of Russian prisons for political prisoners, mm-hmm. for about 10 years. And as you say, he came out of it changed. Mm-hmm. And he said that the big thing that happened to him was that he discovered what he called the cornerstone of justice in the universe, and he rediscovered the reality of God. And so after that, it took a long time. It was his book, The Gulag Archipelago, which I think you mentioned, mm-hmm. you know, details not only his story, but the story of all of those prisoners.
Right.
But it's really a story of gratitude, which just seems strange to us.
It does, yeah.
That you would be in a prison where you're treated terribly, mm-hmm. in a work camp, and yet for him there was a sense that God had a plan for this, and he wrote poems about this, particularly afterwards, about the role of providence. And in one of them he says to the Lord, you were always there right beside me. And that was the approach that he took at the mm-hmm. end of his time in prison, and then afterward when he began to write about all of the evils of Soviet communism, as well as many other subjects, including the difficulties that he saw that were happening here to us in the West.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think he really gives us a good explanation of how evil can run through everyone's heart, and he has a famous quote about that. You know, everybody has a heart which has good and evil, and yeah. But yet he weathered that storm, so to speak. And I know there's a quote in there. When he was first arrested, he was a Marxist, and he just thought that the government was his God in a way, right? Yeah. And that he was better than everybody else. And then at the end, he realized how wrong that was.
Yeah, he reflects on this, and he will often say that he's not a political writer. Mm. He's a writer who's writing. He's a literary artist who's writing about the deepest things, and the deepest things are about the human soul. And that line that you alluded to, you know, the line that runs between good and evil runs mm-hmm. right down the middle of the human soul. Mm-hmm. Right down. The heart, right down the middle of the human heart. And he says, and who wants to cut out a piece of one's own heart? Mm-hmm. So he understood mm-hmm. that. He understood that difficulty, and yet he knew that was the only thing that really could help us, is to actually focus on the heart. And mm-hmm. the only way that the heart can find rest is in God.
In the Red Wheel, there's a quote in there which I really like. Let's see if I can find it here real quick. So one of the characters, Zina, makes no distinction between great and small deeds. Each person, she says, has a certain fund of moral strength, and everyone who uses his strength to the full has performed a great deed. All such people are equals, although to the outside world their actions are incommensurate. Can she be right?
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, it does remind you of many of the classic Catholic spiritual writers who talk about, Therese's little way, or Mother Teresa doing small things with great love. And I think she took that from Teresa of Avila, but that's also Solzhenitsyn's position. And many of the characters that you find in The Red Wheel, which is his novel about the Russian Revolution, or The Gulag Archipelago, which is more of a documentary about the prison system, or his fiction, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is one day in the life of a camp, includes characters who really, they aren't great, but they can do great things if they use that moral fund of theirs, that if they actually do what God intended them to do.
And I think the way he writes, he would be a strong proponent for the dignity of all human life. I mean, that's basically what he's saying. And, in our culture, he would understand why there are people that promote abortion, but he would also, say we need to, work for the dignity of life.
Yeah, he was a great critic of the West. In the chapter that I wrote for the book, as well as several of the other chapters, there's attention paid to really what he says to Westerners, because, for a long time, many people, the Russians, the Soviets, they have problems, but not us. And his reaction to them was, no, you have the same problems that we all have. And it's a problem that's several hundred years old, and it involves abandoning God as the standard for things. And, and he talked about, particular difficulties. He said the West is afflicted with a kind of legalism that says, well, if it's legal, then it's moral. And he says, that's not, on the negative side, you can have things that are legal that are terrible, but even on the positive side, simply doing up to the legal standard isn't what humans are made for. We're meant to be moral heroes.
Yes. And I recall reading, and I'm not sure if it was in this book or not, but Solzhenitsyn said that when he was young, he would hear people say that, all this evil is because we've abandoned God. And then later in his life, he said, all that he's written and so forth, it really comes down, just like what you said, that this evil came because we've abandoned God.
Yeah, he repeats that line in a number of his famous addresses after he came to the West, and in one of them, he won the Templeton Prize for contributions to religion and science and society. And in that speech, he talked about that really this is what happened, is that men have abandoned God. And he said, there's no way out of our problems, he said, except up. That is the only way that we can do that. And it really does affect us if we are connected to God. And we talked about providence earlier. I mean, he also has that strong notion of conscience, that God speaks to us in our inmost hearts and in our minds as well, saying, do this or don't do that, but in a real way, follow me.
He talks about how the importance of art and beauty, how that can counteract the lies, because he lived during a time where Stalin, he forcefully perpetuated, the government is going to make your life, perfect. And if anything, things were worse under Stalin than they were under the Tsar. I mean, it became, in fact, Solzhenitsyn talked about that, in that his conditions, if he had been in a Tsarist prison, it would have been like a holiday probably,
Yeah, he talks about, Chekhov, who was he's also a character on Space Trek, or Star Trek, but, named after a 19th century Russian author. But Chekhov wrote about the cruelty of the prisons of the Tsars. And Solzhenitsyn in several places says he could never have imagined the tortures. And, we don't need to detail them here. You can read his works, but they really were brutal and cruel. And yet, I mean, again, we've talked about this before. Solzhenitsyn had a real sense of providence, and he gave thanks for that experience because it was a purifying experience. And he said to people in the West that, this is part of the problem. If we do not allow that purification to happen where we are,
right?
we may experience it in a much harsher way, just as they did. That tyranny is an ever-present problem, and particularly the tyranny of a godless society.
It's interesting how he was prophetic. So when communism was still going strong, he said that he is going to go back to Russia, and sure enough, it happened.
Yeah, 20 years after he came to the West, when the Soviet Union fell, he was able to return to Russia. And we, probably people who follow the news know that Russia is not exactly the best place in the world right now, but nevertheless, it's not a totalitarian society, and there are currents of thought there and of action that are at least helpful. Solzhenitsyn is taught in the high schools.
Yes.
So, hopefully there will be, we pray for Russia just as we pray for our own country, that line that runs down the middle of the human heart, right, that people will discover that and will act for themselves and for their neighbors to avoid future tyranny.
Yeah. Well, when he talked about going back to Russia, I think that's a time when, Khrushchev was going to destroy us, right? He threatened, so most people would not have thought that he could do that.
No,
back.
most of the smart commentators said, oh, no, Russia is stronger than ever. They beat us into space and, all of this sort of stuff. But Solzhenitsyn said, no, this is a very fragile government, and it's built on lies. And anything that's built on lies will not be able to last. And he was correct.
He was, yeah. It talked about him using a polyphonic method. So he would use many voices, and I think that helps us reach more people. Because when I read the Gulag years ago, I was like, it's a really thick book, but he makes it interesting, I think, because of all those different voices.
Yeah. That notion of polyphony, of different sounds, different instruments, and in literature, of different characters who have different motivations, it makes it all the stronger because, we've all read literature or seen a movie where the good people were all purely good and the bad people were all purely bad, but because he had that understanding of the human heart, he was able to depict characters who were very mixed.
Right.
And he could show that sometimes the character that you didn't think would come through with the goodness would be that person. And sometimes even the good people could be moral cowards.
Right.
And I think that's why he thought, and he was very Russian in this sense, that he thought that literature was kind of a sort of prophecy or prophetic vocation. And it involved telling the truth, and that meant telling the ugly truth about all of us, as well as what is good and what is noble, and what reflects our beings as image of God.
And I think if he were writing today in America, where we have abortion on demand from, the very early stages of the nascent life, right up until birth, and some people are advocating after birth, I think he would probably use that same, approach.
I think he would probably, if he were to write on abortion, he would have a very human depiction, even of those who are involved in the cause of having more abortions or keeping it legal. And yet he was always very clear about what the truth was. But it's just that art has to depict the humanity of it, and that's good for us too, because really what we need to do is see the people that we are opposed to politically and in the moral sphere as human beings who are created by God, and they too have hearts that have good and evil in them, and we want to win them over so that they can hear God's voice and change.
So, Solzhenitsyn wrote a lot of books and a lot of work. What would you say are some of the, if you only have time to read one or two of his works, what would you recommend?
Well, I would say probably the one that more people know, and I think there's a good reason for it because it's a brilliant little work, is One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was kind of miraculously published during Khrushchev's administration in the Soviet Union in the 1960s.
That is amazing, right? I
Yeah.
mean,
It was, I mean, Khrushchev was a figure who kind of wanted to say, well, yeah, it was all Stalin's fault. And Solzhenitsyn says he was a little naive about that. And of course, he later had to crack down on things because he was opening the doors to more freedom and more goodness, and that had to be closed. But Solzhenitsyn's novella was able to be published. It's less than 200 pages. And as the title has it, it's one day in the life of an ordinary prisoner, not a super good guy, but also not a bad guy, but an ordinary and everyman who's caught in the middle. And he has characters who are truly vicious that he has to respond to.
Yeah.
And there are also a kind of quasi-saints.
yeah,
fellow-
like the Baptist, right?
Alyosha the Baptist.
Yeah, yeah.
And he's caught in the middle. And so it depicts that churn within him
Yeah, yeah.
about how do I make things. And at the end of the book, he says, he says, it was a good day for Ivan Denisovich. He was almost a happy one. That almost is important.
Yeah.
Because he hasn't quite reached it. But that helps us because it makes us realize, we're not completely all the way there either. But if we continue to follow conscience and follow goodness, listen to those, those crazy saint-like figures, then it will probably be okay.
Well, I think he shows that there's an attraction towards the good, right? When you have a fellow prisoner that's thanking God for, these little things, and you have to decide, am I extremely bitter, or do I want to be a little bit better like this other prisoner?
Yeah. He's fully aware of the fact that not everybody who went to the prisons came out a better person, and that you could be embittered.
Right.
But at the same time, he was always grateful for this experience, and he wanted to depict those experiences in such a way that people could be grateful for the difficulty in their life. I mean, he said, this is one of his problems with Americans and with the West. He says, we're obsessed with happiness, but it's a sort of low-level happiness.
Correct. Yeah.
Material goods and experiences and things like that. But he says, what we really need to do is develop the human soul, and that requires asceticism, more, exercise in taming our desires and turning us toward God, and it also requires a deep concentration. And in our world of the 24/7 scrolling of the phones, it's really hard to find that concentration. That's why when he lived in America, it was before the internet, but
Right.
he wouldn't play the TV at all, and he would unplug the phone because he wanted to actually have an experience of concentration on the work that he was doing and on living his life. And maybe we don't need to do that in that such an extreme way, but I do think that that's one of our problems is our callousness comes from the fact that, we can always distract ourselves with the internet.
Yeah, I think, he essentially is helping us understand, there's different levels of happiness, and the lowest level is the basic pleasures. But when you get really to the most enduring and long-lasting, that's trying to do God's will and or involved in your community. And then if you are have that relationship with God, you look at Saint Maximilian Kolbe. I mean, he was in a horrible situation, starved to death with these other prisoners, but yet he had a peace and continence that you just couldn't explain otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes back to that theme of providence, and you see this in many of Solzhenitsyn's memoirs, that he had the real sense that he was doing what God wanted him to do, and that there was a plan for him, even in the darkest moments, that he wanted to hold to. And for him, that was the true happiness. That was the way in which you forge your soul, was by responding to conscience and responding to God. Right. And that means something that's very difficult in many cases. And if you don't respond to it, it's going to get more difficult. So better to stand up right now and do the right thing, even if it's hard.
Yeah, I like to use the analogy that if you try to have that relationship, it's like you have a well-kept lawn, right? And so if a weed, a seed from a weed comes into that lawn, it's probably not going to stick, right? I mean, and again, nobody's perfect, but the more you work on that relationship, the more inner peace that you can have.
That's right. Like I say, his approach to Americans and to the West was, the problem is we allow those weeds to grow up, and of course, what happens? The lawn gets taken over, right? Or
Right.
in human terms, we become slaves.
Yeah.
And he realized that many people would rather be slaves than be free and be truly happy in that ultimate sense.
Well, and a lot of people, even though in our country, we have a lot of freedoms that other countries don't have, there are people who become slaves to materialism, slaves to, sexuality, slaves to, drugs, and you have to have some responsibility to have real freedom, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, is that, he would sometimes speak disparagingly of happiness itself, but what he meant was that sort of low level,
Correct.
material happiness, the experience of, say, drugs and sex and things like that. And he'd say, but these things are essentially fool's gold.
Yeah.
You can't develop any sort of a society that's heroic and that takes care of the lowest and the littlest among us in a place where people are focused simply on that low level of happiness, or on, as we mentioned before, simply meeting the lowest level of the legal dictates. That's not a society that we really want to live in.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't foster happiness.
Right.
Just for our viewers who may not have a lot of familiarity with what happened, in the Russian Revolution, I think a lot of people don't understand that, some of the supporters of the revolution were literally slaughtered when Stalin came into power. So in a way, it's like, be careful what you wish for, right?
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this is one of the perennial problems, is that people think, well, as long as I become a supporter of the bad guys in charge, they'll be okay with me. But the problem is that they're as cruel to their own supporters as they are to their opponents. And if you read any of Solzhenitsyn or anybody else who wrote about that time, what they had particularly throughout Stalin's time, but even before, were show trials in which they decide that, well, in order to show everybody that we're still in charge, we're going to take down everybody. And that meant many of the party officials themselves. One day you're at the top, and then for no reason at all other than a need to show that we're rooting out evil, you get kicked to the side. And so it's, we think, well, the path of least resistance is to just go along with them. But it may be a path of least resistance for a little bit, but then it also means that you might be the first one to be sacrificed.
Right, yeah. It can be far worse than just getting kicked to the side. It's literally, taken out.
If I can tell you a story, you've probably read this before, but Solzhenitsyn tells, when he's writing about people who are being interrogated, when they're arrested for these camps, and he says, what was amazing is that sometimes the people who got away were the people who simply refused to cooperate at all. And he tells the story of an old woman who had supposedly hosted the bishop, or something like that, a priest who'd come through, and they said, this is wrong. And they said, where is he? And she said, you know what, I'm not going to tell you anything. So you might as well just kill me right now, because I know that I am in the right and I am ready to face God.
Good for her.
So go ahead. And he says,
remarkably,
these men who knew that they were doing bad, surely, were
in their hearts.
In their hearts, they were so shocked by this that they just let her go. And it's it's a good lesson for us that if we're bold for God and take care of His business, He'll take care of ours.
Yeah, and, I think that sometimes people don't really think about when government becomes so large. In essence, it is a god for people, and that's why Lenin and Stalin, they did what they could to destroy the church, because that was competition for government as God.
Right. I mean, that's when Solzhenitsyn talks about our problems in the West, he says, well, we have the same problems because we're losing that sense that, the American founders, whatever the orthodoxy of their Christianity, they had a conception of our rights and our legal system as being, he says, under God. And as long as you have that, things, it's not that it'll be perfect, but you won't have the same sort of tyranny that you have when a government declares that it itself is God. And one of the interesting things that if you read, some of Lenin's works, Vladimir Lenin, not John Lennon, but if you read his works, he's very clear that there can be no sense of biblical commands or even any kind of generic, abstract moral law. It's only the good of the state. Yeah. And when you hear that, it's terrible because what is the good of the state but the good of those who are controlling the levers of power? You need a government that's under God in order to be happy.
What's so ironic is that when Stalin was in the seminary is when he read about Marx and communism, and later in his life, his mother said, the world would have been better if you had been a priest.
Right.
Unfortunately, we have just a couple minutes. You have a closing comments for us?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that really now is a good time for people to be reading Solzhenitsyn and reading about him because, we're at a tough point in our own history where there is a lot of chaos, tyranny and chaos. And these are all the things that Solzhenitsyn said, you Americans, you think that you're immune to this, but the very same thing can happen to you because you're approaching things in the very same way that we did in Russia. So I think Solzhenitsyn is really a good person to be reading. And you asked me about books, and I mentioned One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. If you want to get a good one-volume collection of Solzhenitsyn's writings, the Solzhenitsyn Reader, which was edited by Dan Mahoney and Edward Erickson.
Okay.
It comes from ISI Press, Intercollegiate Studies Institute Press. And it's about 500 pages, but it has poetry, it has short stories, it has speeches, and it has some of the greatest hits from some of the longer works, like the Gulag Archipelago and the Red Wheel that we've mentioned in the show.
Good. And one last one is Solzhenitsyn and American Culture.
Yes, and please buy our book as well. Lots of chapters about Solzhenitsyn and other great Russian witnesses to the truth.
Good. Well, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Russ. It's been great.
All right. We'll be back again with the Rooney Report.
We provide the legal defense to the people who really are the last line of defense to these women and these babies. That's why Life Legal does what they do, because someone like Father James Linton isn't going to be able to hire a huge firm and pay thousands of dollars to litigate a criminal case, but Life Legal is able to do that because of the support of our donors and that people find what we do to be important.